Okay, so welcome everyone to GTM Talks. My name is Madison Skidmore. We're so happy to have you all joining us today. My colleague Brittany Wesek and I will be hosting today's lecture. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're tuning in today from St. Augustine, Florida. The chat box is also where you can ask questions during the presentation, and your questions will be answered afterwards during a Q&A session. GTM Talks is a virtual lecture series that highlights research and monitoring efforts at the reserve. Each lecture within the series has focused on at least one of the reserve's management plan goals, which are to focus on natural biodiversity, improve water quality, enhance understanding of sea level rise and climate change impacts, improve visitor experiences while minimizing resource damage, and increase awareness of cultural history. Today's discussion will highlight the study of natural biodiversity in relation to sea level rise and climate change impacts. So I'm going to pass it over to Brittany to help us out with some Zoom etiquette today.
Thank you, Madison. Hi, everyone. So as Madison had said, my name is Brittany Wesek. I'm the Public Outreach Coordinator at GTM Research Reserve. I'm going to just go ahead and show you, in case you're not familiar with Zoom yet, although I know it's becoming quite the norm, or has been. Anyway, if you look here where my mouse is pointing, this microphone, if you keep that muted throughout the presentation, we will allow verbal questions throughout at the end for a Q&A. And then for today, we do ask that you keep your video off, that way just to make sure we can avoid any potential glitches of, you know, overpiling the system, so to say. And then if you look at over here, there's the chat box, and that's how you can ask questions by typing them out throughout the presentation. And even if they don't get answered right away, we will go back to those at the end. And then we also ask if, you know, just add a little fun element, you can also add a reaction over here. So such as, you know, wow, or clapping your hands or something to emphasize, just to make things more personal, I guess, than just virtual. So anyway, I will be passing it back to Madison, and we will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Brittany. So today we are so excited to introduce our speaker, Barbara Blonder, Associate Professor of Natural Sciences at Flagler College. Today we will learn about her 18 years as an Associate Professor, initiating Flagler College's undergraduate research program and serving as its inaugural director. As a visiting investigator at GTM Research Reserve, Blonder has led research students and volunteers in focusing on coastal ecosystem disturbance ecology and conservation, with emphases on fire ecology and storm impacts on these sensitive and highly threatened areas. Today, she will also discuss hurricanes and implications for conservation planning. And today, we will actually give it over to Barbara. You can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, for being here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to share what we've been working on for so long with you all. And I think you'll find it, hopefully, interesting. You may notice some similarity between one of the hosts in the GTM NER and the center person in the photograph. She was one of my students back in the day, and now she's working for the Research Reserve, Madison Skidmore. I couldn't be more proud of her. And it's that's just kind of the coolest part about all of this, is being able to really just see what happens with the students who get involved in our research and contribute and then move on and do great things out in the world. And that's actually going to be a focus of my talk as well. But the title is, as you can see, about hurricanes, a weird term called coastal squeeze, which I'll talk about, keystone species, and it's all about conservation, how we protect our biodiversity. So just to begin with, brief introduction that Madison already shared with you. This is actually, this month is my 18th anniversary at Flagler College. I was the one and only science professor there, and we've now grown to, well, in full time, we've now grown to a science major, two science minors, and we are getting ready to launch a second full biology major. So it is a real pleasure to be able to share our successes with you all and to share some of what we have learned. What I'll talk about today is one, start with why the Research Reserve is so important and so many ways. Secondly, I'll then explain how one research effort led to this one and beyond. So we started with one and kind of veered off into another, which is really one of the fun parts about science. I'll then explain our research methods and our findings and conclude with the implications and practical applications of this research. So I hope that I don't have a lot of background noise. I do have a dog and a grown son in the room. I'm here with the best Wi-Fi in the house. So please be patient if you do hear some background noise, we'll work on it. So the importance of the reserve is really well illustrated by these two photographs side by side. On the right, you'll see Dr. Jessica Veenstra, one of my colleagues at the college, teaching 3 of my students in a capstone research course. It's a senior level course that every one of our majors and minors needs to take and undertake their own research in order to be able to claim a degree in coastal environmental science or environmental science minor. And it's this hands-on kind of teaching that really defines what we do at Flagler College with undergraduate research. We're in the field with our students, we're in the lab with our students, and we learn from each other. And it's just my favorite part of the entire experience. On the left side, you'll see the coastal strand ecosystem, which is what the focus of my research has been about. I know it's a dirty job, but somebody has to go out there and climb the dunes and just experience this wonderful scenery and one of the most beautiful environments I can think of. So the reserve is essential at protecting and educating people about this coastal environment and all they have done to protect it and help us in so doing. What I want to note on the downside of this coastal ecosystem, this coastal strand, which is one of the most threatened ecosystems in the state, is that even between 1992 and 2004 alone, that's not a long time. We got, just a short span of time, 25% of coastal uplands were lost to human development. That pace of development has not slowed in spite of the hurricanes, the storms, the flooding, that really hasn't slowed very much. And so the remnant bits of coastal strand that we have left are really, really special. And the GTM Research Reserve has done a fabulous job of protecting this remnant. And I encourage anyone who hasn't been to the South Ponte Vedra dunes up at the Research Reserve to go ahead and visit. They have 3 different access points that are just spectacular. And so this is a largely intact coastal strand ecosystem that the Research Reserve has protected. Fortuitously for me and my research team, I love doing research out there and have spent quite a number of days, hours, weekends, and vacations out there enjoying it. I want to emphasize too, as Madison discussed, there are 5 different goals in the management plan for the Research Reserve. And 2 of those goals are directly connected to the research that we've been undertaking since 2014. Those would be the natural biodiversity goal and the understanding of the sea level rise and climate change impacts in particular. 2 of my research group's publications have come out based on the research we've conducted there since 2014 in refereed scientific publications. And this one that I'm highlighting here is the most recent one published in January of this year. And it is, as you can see from the title, it's very similar to the title for this presentation with good reason, is because they're the same thing. But anyway, the climate-related loss of habitat for threatened species is one of the hot topics, pun intended, sorry about that, hot topics in ecological research. And so we're seeing a lot more focus on these types of impacts from climate-related changes. And so that's what we're focused on here in this particular research. All right, I'm going to start with a picture's worth 1,000 words here and talk about coastal squeeze. As you can see from the definition, coastal squeeze is now defined as the loss of natural habitats or deterioration of their quality arising from anthropogenic structures or actions preventing the landward transgression of those habitats that would otherwise naturally occur in response to sea level rise in conjunction with other coastal processes. Coastal squeeze affects habitat on the seaward side of existing structures. So that's the definition. But before I jump into what I'm going to talk about with regard to the research, we really need to understand these concepts such as coastal squeeze. I want to go through a couple other definitions in this definition. Anthropogenic means human caused. If people aren't aware of that, that's what it means. So the things that we are doing to change the environment, such as habitat alteration, such as climate, causing the climate crisis and so on. Also, the prevention of landward transgression of those habitats basically means, if you look from right to left, at least from my right, oceanward to landward in this slide, any organism that would typically be found between the high tide line or even the low tide line and the vegetated line of the dune systems in a natural environment has nowhere to go if there's flooding on the oceanward side. In other words, they are squeezed between human development on the landward side, these condominiums, the State Road A1A, for example, and the natural environment of the Atlantic Ocean. So if you live anywhere between there, including humans, there's less and less land available for you to live on. Your habitat is getting squeezed. And the concept of coastal squeeze now is encompassing salt marshes as well on the western or the landward side of these ecosystems, these barrier island dunes, for example, and even on the mainland in salt marshes, because again, with sea level rise, with increased flooding, the migration, what would normally happen where the ecosystem could migrate, the animals could migrate, the plants could migrate away from the rising seas and the rising estuaries, there's nowhere for them to go because of human development. So this is a slide that really brings that to the fore. I took this picture just a week or so ago at a place I often go to on Volano Beach, just to take my dog for a walk or whatever. And in the foreground, you can, if you look closely, you can see little sprigs. These are sprigs of sea oats and spartina or salt meadow cordgrass that have been planted by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who is nourishing this beach. In other words, they're pumping sand out of the intercoastal and offshore, and they're putting that, they're depositing it on the beach in order to help slow down the rates of erosion that have been happening from the naturally occurring nor'easters as well as the hurricanes that we've experienced. So lots and lots of erosion, lots of loss of material from these beaches, as we're all aware, anybody who goes to the beach. The house in the very background, in the very farthest away point, those houses on the oceanfront themselves are experiencing loss of dune and also collapsing into the ocean in many cases. So they are also being impacted, and that's why the Corps of Engineers has been brought in for this very expensive project to try to nourish this beach. Okay, so given that coastal squeeze background, I want to go ahead and start talking about the research focus that we've been engaged in since 2014. I've been taking advantage of the GTM Research Reserve's living laboratory for classes as well as research for over 15 years now. We've had a memorandum of understanding, actually a formal one, that partners our organization's formally. And so we've had that in existence for over 15 years, and we've definitely taken advantage of that. So my classes in ecology or whatever, coastal Strand ecology and capstone research courses have been focused year after year at the Research Reserve. In 2014, the reserve staff conducted a prescribed fire, which is a management strategy that is often used in protecting natural areas, especially in Florida, and I'll get into that some more. But they did it for what is the first known time in the coastal dune system, a prescribed fire in our coastal dune ecosystem. So while prescribed fire, which is an ecological disturbance, and I'll talk more about that term in a moment, is widely known to be an essential component of nearly all Florida ecosystems, virtually nothing was known about its effects in the coastal strand habitat. So we began formulating hypotheses, collecting data, testing those hypotheses in relationship to this prescribed fire research. And that research was concluded in 2018 and published at that time in a separate paper. You can see here some examples of ecological disturbance. And so let's go ahead with that next essential definition before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this research. As you can see, it's an ecological disturbance is a temporary disruption in the environment resulting from abiotic, biotic, or anthropogenic factors, causing a pronounced change in an ecosystem. The impact of an ecological disturbance plays a significant role in shaping the species diversity within the ecosystem. Three examples really of ecological disturbance can be seen here. The first is this prescribed fire. And that is on A1A and South Ponte Vedra Beach within the GTM Research Reserve back in 2014. Very extreme fire behavior, and that might or might not have been expected by the fire crew, but they were certainly prepared for it. And that did have impacts, and we wanted to see what the change, the response of the vegetation in that coastal strand ecosystem was to the application of prescribed fire. So that's what we focused on. Fire, whether prescribed or naturally caused, is an ecological disturbance. Temporary, it meets all of these criteria. Abiotic then, the example of abiotic would certainly be an abiotic factor in ecological disturbance would certainly be fire, and also would be storms, would be flooding. So here's a picture of Hurricane Matthew with Tropical Storm Nicole lined up right behind it. And so we do get hurricanes. Those have always been part of shaping Florida, but as most of you are aware, they are becoming more intense and possibly more frequent as well. This is the aftermath of not a hurricane, and that's me in that kayak. Quite a few years ago, that was actually before Hurricane Matthew. And it's a good example of how sunny day flooding, not in this case, but sunny day flooding and sea level rise are impacting the city of St. Augustine and other low-lying coastal communities. Because we had a big rainstorm and the tide was high, the streets didn't drain, and I got my kayak out. So there you have it. One of the things I want to move on to is that ecological disturbances can be perceived as negative, but that's not always the case. They've shaped our natural communities. They've shaped the life histories of many of the organisms that are actually dependent on things like prescribed fire or naturally occurring fire. And they are, these ecological disturbances can actually be essential to sustaining some of our most cherished ecosystems. However, the rate at which some of these ecological disturbances like flooding, erosion, more intense storms, and clearly more intense fires, especially if you're out west, is now occurring far too fast for many of these ecosystems and their organisms to adapt to it. One of those, and here's the segue to our research, one of those endearing, important, and highly threatened organisms is the gopher tortoise. And here are two examples. One of my photographs from the Research Reserve in the study site on the left, and that's a real typical sighting in the summertime, and then the one on the right. So an introduction to the gopher tortoise. They are terrestrial, which means they are a tortoise. They're not a turtle. They do not spend part of their life in the water. Although they have been seen swimming in the ocean, we think that's because they're trying to get rid of ticks or just cool off. We're not sure. They can swim, but they are not aquatic. They don't spend their lives in the water. They dig really deep, sometimes over 20 feet long, often winding burrows that they take refuge in from various environmental conditions, such as extreme heat in the summer. They'll go in the burrow during the heat of the day, come out early in the morning or later in the afternoon in order to forage for their preferred plant food sources, as they are vegetarians. They actually even do a sort of hibernation during the wintertime in those burrows. They won't come out until the air temperature is, because, you know, they're reptiles. So they need to have warm enough, but not too warm. They have a narrow range of temperatures, in other words, that they're comfortable in. So those burrows allow them an escape from temperatures that are not conducive to them. I want to take a moment to talk about burrow classification, because that's an important tool that researchers like myself use in order to come up with estimates as to gopher tortoise population sizes. So a tortoise will use in their lifetimes, and even in a season, one season to the next, they'll use multiple burrows. They'll actually dig out these burrows, use them for a few months, and then move over to a different burrow. Say they've run out of food, their preferred food at one burrow site, they go to the next burrow site, or they have better access to sun, you know, during certain times of the year, during certain months, and they want to stay warm. So the orientation of one burrow might be better than another one. So getting back to activity, if you look at the picture on the right, you can see where there is a smooth sand entrance to the burrow, and that's called an apron. And also you might be able to see on the kind of the right-hand side in front of the gopher tortoise's foot, a couple of paw prints. And what the gopher tortoises do, they're basically like tanks. They walk, but they drag the bottom parts of their shell for the most part along the sand, smoothing it out. And just so that's how we know a burrow is active. We classify it as active. If we can see fresh sign of the gopher tortoise, the smoothed apron and the paw prints, then we know that gopher tortoise has been out and about within the last day or so. We call that an active burrow. An inactive burrow might be a burrow that the tortoise maintains but is not currently using. And so it will be, if you can look at the burrow behind the gopher tortoise on the right, you'll see it's relatively clear, but it may not have any recent sign of activity. That we call an inactive burrow. And then a burrow which is partially collapsed, or there's a whole lot of stuff growing in it, looks like it hasn't been used in a very long time, we call abandoned. So if you'll keep those three, active, inactive, and abandoned activity status classifications in mind, that's essential to part of our research. Most of the research, in fact, the overwhelming majority of research that has been conducted on gopher tortoises has been conducted in inland ecosystems, where they have been thought of as being an essential part of the longleaf pine wiregrass ecosystems. They used to range from all over the Southeast, and that range has been restricted mostly due to human activity. I want to talk a little bit more about why gopher tortoises are really special. And this, I think, is the last of my definitions. And that's that of a keystone species. It's the glue that holds a habitat together. It may not be the largest or most plentiful species in an ecological community, but if the keystone's removed, it sets off a chain of events that turns the structure and biodiversity of its habitat into something very different. This is absolutely the case with the gopher tortoises. They are ecosystem engineers. When they build these burrows, they are not the only ones who take advantage of the burrows. Everything from insects like scarab beetles to really rare species like the gopher frog, which is only found in association with the gopher tortoise burrow. Indigo snakes, which are exceedingly rare, are also often found dependent on gopher tortoise burrows. So on the right side at the top, you can see a separate entrance that maybe the mouse or the snake has branched off into. And so they may not all be living in the same exact burrow together, but parts of the burrow. In fact, as many as 300 other species have been documented to cohabitate or use some portion of the gopher tortoise burrow at some point in their life history. That's why they're keystone species. And many very rare species are entirely dependent on these burrows. Since only a handful of other papers have been published on coastal gopher tortoises, not much is known about the coastal populations and their ecological role. So with regard to our methods, once we were looking at the prescribed fire impacts starting in 2014, we also decided, since we were sampling vegetation and walking the entire 3-mile stretch of the coastal dune system in order to take our vegetation samples up in South Ponte Vedra Beach, we decided to go ahead and help out the Guana Reserve. They do a periodic gopher tortoise survey, and we were out there anyway. I had done research on gopher tortoises in the past. So I thought, why don't we collect gopher tortoise data and help them update their annual survey? So we did that, and that we finished in 2016, concurrent with our vegetation sampling. And that was early summer of 2016. And if you think about it, something pretty major happened in the fall of 2016. If you were here, you know what I mean. And that was Hurricane Matthew. On the right side is where we rode the storm, and that's downtown St. Augustine. We were up high and dry, but it was quite an experience that I don't want to share again. And on the left side, there are 2 photographs that I've taken. One was before Hurricane Matthew, and that's actually one of our study sites for the vegetation sampling. You might be able to see a vaguely white transect line, even more vaguely as a perpendicular yellow transect line. And so we have these big vegetation plots, and we would survey the vegetation. Where we usually found the gopher tortoises is either at the base of the dune that you can see on the left-hand side in the top, or on the dune itself, somewhere on the dune itself. And that's where we usually found the gopher tortoises. That's pre-Matthew. Look at the vegetative cover pre-Matthew compared to both hurricanes Matthew and Irma, the aftermath of both of those. That's on the bottom. So keep those images in mind too, if you will. Or, oops, I don't want to do that. Okay. Secondly, what I want to talk about now then is the hypotheses that led to our current research, which is what I'll focus on today. We noted, and this is your observation in science, okay, that back-to-back hurricanes clearly destroyed the beach habitat, eroded the dunes, and killed off the vegetation. So what we wanted to find out, what we wanted to test, these are our multiple hypotheses, were gopher tortoise burrows destroyed? If so, how many? Was their habitat and their food source reduced? If so, by how much? Did the gopher tortoises survive? And if they did, how did that happen in the face of such intense storms back to back, 11 months between the 2 storms? And what might this mean for the ecological role that gopher tortoises play in the coastal strand ecosystem? So those were our working hypotheses. In the photo to your left, you'll see a group of students that took a summer course with me. That was post-hurricanes, and I wanted to go out and grab data on the gopher tortoise burrows, what happened in order to help answer those hypotheses, the questions in those hypotheses. So this group of students was with me for the first part of the summer, collecting a whole bunch of data right after Hurricane Matthew, as it turned out. So on the left, you see the data collection process with a smiling group of students in a beautiful habitat. And on the bottom, you'll see a summary of our survey dates and hurricanes. What I want to point out is that before the hurricanes, we sampled 396 different burrows of different activity classifications. We measured their size, we documented their activity. And we also, if you see in the photograph, that yellow thing that Sabrina is holding is a GPS unit where we were able to map each of these burrows, and you'll see a map of that later on. We were able to get in between May and June of 2017 and survey only about 1/4 as many burrows as we were able to survey before Irma hit in September when the students came back to classes. So we really didn't get a chance to complete that survey, but we did survey post-Matthew, post-Irma, We finished up the survey in May of 2018. So that we had to break it up. And lastly, I want to show you what could have been. In Fort Matanzas National Monument, this picture on the right is a dune that was so severely eroded that it became a cliff. A human couldn't climb up that, not without a ladder. And at the very base of it, you'll see a gopher tortoise burrow, because that's all the habitat that's left for those tortoises. And that habitat there is absolutely subject to more flooding. So I think the tortoises down in the Matanzas Inlet were probably hit quite a bit harder than the ones that we have up in the GTM Research Reserve. All right, so in terms of our methods, we had baseline data. In other words, pre-hurricane data. We had 396 burrows that we sampled. We began sampling the burrows after the hurricanes. As I said, we were interrupted. And we collected that post-hurricane data. We completed it and compared it with the pre-hurricane data. We tested again for burrow activity, active, inactive, and abandoned. We tested for density, which is the number of burrows found in a particular area. And in this case, it's hectares. And we measured the size of the burrows. We used also geospatial data analysis, which is ArcView. It's also really what you use when you use maps to navigate from one place to another. There's different layers of data. And if you see a gas station on your map, that's one layer of data, for example. A street sign is another layer of data. And in our cases, we were able to use vegetative cover data and compare both before and after hurricanes to the vegetation cover for the study area at the Research Reserve. So for our results, I'll go through these just a second here. I need to grab a glass of water. I'm going to take a minute or two to go over what's on each of these slides and orient you before we talk about what the implications are. So this is the number of burrows in each of the activity classifications: active, inactive, and abandoned, before and after hurricanes. Before hurricanes is 2016 in green. After hurricanes is 2018 in blue. On the y-axis, the left-hand side is the number of burrows. And then you can see the actual numbers above each of the bars in the bar graphs. And then we have a summary table in the bottom here. So if you'll look with me at the far left set of bars, that pair of bars, this represents active burrows. There were 183 active burrows in 2016, and that number increased by a substantial amount, by 1/3 to 243 in 2018. On the next set of bars, you'll see a drop in inactive burrows from 148, nearly more than 50% drop to 70 inactive burrows after the hurricanes. And overall, what that means to me, okay, because the burrow numbers didn't change all that dramatically. Total numbers were 396 pre-hurricane, 358 post-hurricane. That might indicate some sampling error. It might indicate some gopher tortoise die-off. We don't really know. But it's not a huge difference in number proportionally. But what we do see is a big change, a big jump in the number of active burrows by 1/3, and a big decrease in the number of inactive burrows. What this is, how we interpreted this is that gopher tortoises that were impacted, their burrows were impacted by flooding or erosion due to the hurricane effects, moved into whatever was available. So say you've got your dream home and it's flooded by a hurricane, you move into your parents' garage apartment, okay, for lack of a better comparison. It's not ideal, but it gets you where, it gets you a roof over your head. So that's what we think the gopher tortoises did. They probably shifted from, they might have redug abandoned burrows, they might have cleared them out, they occupied otherwise unoccupied inactive burrows, and they therefore there were more burrows that showed up as active after the hurricanes in our data set. We also think they were sharing burrows in some cases because they're known to do that on occasion. And that was documented at the Matanzas Inlet as well. one of the researchers saw that after Hurricane Matthew, the sharing of burrows. Okay, results number 2. What happened to the vegetative cover and what happened to the suitable habitat for gopher tortoises? This is an aerial image that shows both pre-hurricanes and post-hurricanes. So before hurricanes, let me orient you better, I'm sorry. The ocean is off to the right in this photograph. The waves are the whitish stuff as you move landward from the Atlantic Ocean landward. The beach and dune system is indicated by the 2 green colors. Pre-hurricanes is in the dark green, post-hurricanes is in the light green, and then moving westward, we get into the research reserve, the west side of it, the peninsula they call it, and the wetlands over there. So that's what's depicted in this overall photograph. If you look at the dark green, that is the extent of vegetative cover and suitable habitat for gopher tortoises above the high tide line before the hurricanes. It was reduced by a third, okay, nearly a third. 30% in the light green is all that was remaining of that suitable habitat and vegetative cover after hurricanes Irma and Matthew. So the implications are there was a significant overall loss of suitable habitat and food availability, indicating the threat of coastal squeeze for this population. Thirdly, we tested whether the gopher tortoises had moved burrows, if they had relocated. And indeed, what we see, this is another aerial image overlaid on it is our burrow locations that we mapped for each of the pre and post-hurricane surveys. In the blue, again, the ocean is off to your right. The waves you can see a little bit more clearly here. The beach, the open beach area, and then where the burrows were. So the burrows were located in some cases what is now sand. In the blue is what you see as burrows. They don't burrow in the open sand environment of the beach. They burrow within the vegetated environment or on top of the dunes, but they don't burrow where the high tide can get them. So that means that those burrows no longer exist. In fact, you only see what exists after the hurricanes as the yellow burrows. And so that also indicates a movement of the gopher tortoises landward away from the eroded area of the coastal strand ecosystem. So there was likely some good quality habitat at lower elevations that was also lost and also implies coastal squeeze. Finally, we have our changes to the burrow density. And in this case, again, y-axis shows you the burrow density per hectare. The x-axis is year and the comparison of the density per hectare. So in 2016, the density of active burrows was lower than it was in 2018. That means there were more burrows per area. Think about how much the area was reduced, the 30% reduction in area. That might explain why the gopher tortoises have to move more closely together into a more densely occupied area. Similarly, in 2018, we have a increase in burrow density between, inactive burrows increase in density from one year to the next, and sorry about that, and the active burrows increase in density from one year to the next, the pre and post-hurricane years. So overall, in both cases, it was about a 16% increase in density for both inactive and active burrows, pre-hurricane, post-hurricane, again, indicating more dense crowding of the gopher tortoise burrows in a smaller area that they could stay in. So now we have crowding, potentially increased competition for food because a lot of the vegetation was lost, increased competition for the best habitat. And also with gopher tortoises, when they are crowded, they have an increased risk for disease transmission, just like pretty much any other organism. Okay, so what does this all mean? I'm going to review our hypotheses and kind of talk about our conclusions at this point. So we noted that the hurricanes destroyed the habitat. How did the storms impact the coastal gopher tortoises? We found that gopher tortoise burrows were destroyed. As you'll remember, the dots indicating the burrows in the lower elevations. We found that habitat, okay, burrows were destroyed, habitat was destroyed, vegetation was reduced, as indicated by the geospatial satellite imagery, pre and post hurricane. It appears that because we didn't have a lot of loss in sheer number of gopher tortoise burrows, that they might have survived in the lower elevation loss of burrows by moving to different burrows in higher elevations on the dunes. And I want to talk about the ecological role more in an upcoming slide, because that's more of a, how do we interpret all this? And what did we find that was kind of beyond the scope of this particular study? But these are the take-home messages, that we've got some impacts for sure, as we would have expected, as we predicted in our hypotheses from the hurricanes, and we know what those impacts were. The next steps then, we began to look at if gopher tortoises are vegetarians, and we don't know very much about the coastal populations of them. They are certainly not found in longleaf wiregrass communities in coastal locations, because we really don't have any. And so we know what they eat in longleaf wiregrass interior or inland communities. That's been well documented, but nobody really knows what they eat out here. And really these pretty low nutrient, not very diverse vegetative ecosystems of the coastal strand. So we also began because these gopher tortoises eat leaves, fruits, and seeds, we began going to one way of looking at what they eat without actually having to survey them, because they won't be able to tell us. But we do know that what goes in as vegetation, whether it be seeds, leaves, or fruit, comes out as scat in kind of a flattened oblong pellet. So we did go out and collected a number of these scats post-hurricanes to see what they might have been surviving on after hurricanes. And we can then compare that to, hopefully we'll have recovery. We are starting to have recovery of vegetation along these coastal strand dune systems. The vegetation is spreading, and we want to see what the gopher tortoises are eating now when they have the full buffet, if you will, of what's available to them on their menu. But right after the hurricanes, they did not have that full buffet. A lot of vegetation was destroyed. But it does appear from our research so far that preliminary results indicate that they're passing seeds intact into these scat pellets, which are, as you might imagine, nutrient rich. They're pre-fertilized, in other words, and that might actually accelerate the reestablishment of vegetation in these impacted ecosystems. On the left-hand side, what you see are my three students at the time. They were taking apart very carefully, dissecting the scat, which had been sterilized. It's fine, and they are using gloves and so forth. They then take it and put it through the sieve system on the left-hand side, those round canisters that have different size openings, and that sorts them into different size particles. And then they further, along with Dr. Lee Newsom, who is an expert at this, she's an environmental archaeologist who works collaboratively with us, but does much greater things as well. She has helped us identify where these plant fragments, what species they belong to. And that's what you see in each of these Petri dishes, as well as the bags. So those are the plant fragments that have been identified to species, and they might be seed or other plant remnant that survive through the digestive tract of the gopher tortoise that produce the scat. So the implications, what does this all mean for all of us? And by the way, this is a very adorable baby gopher tortoise. I've not seen many of these in my time, and I definitely wanted to include that slide as a result. Okay, so here's the implications. If you look on the right-hand side and think about keystone species again, we saw coach whip snakes in burrows and using the dune systems. We saw evidence of red foxes using an abandoned burrow as their own. Previous research in another coastal location has identified as many as 33 bird species that we have at the reserve that are known to use gopher tortoise burrows, particularly the aprons. And so that is your keystone species right there. It may have its own importance in the coastal ecosystems on that basis alone as providing habitat for these other species dependent on their burrows. They are known through other literature, other scientific studies to increase plant diversity and richness and disperse seeds in other ecosystems. We've seen that they indeed pass intact seeds along in their scat here as well. So we therefore infer that they are probably playing that role in this ecosystem, this coastal ecosystem, which is important. Because if that's the case, they may actually be helping with reestablishing dunes by essentially seeding the dunes, just like in that Army Corps of Engineers reseeding project that you saw in one of the first slides where they had planted a bunch of sea oats and spartina, the salt meadow cordgrass. The gopher tortoises are doing that just by virtue of the fact of eating, making their lives. So we think that we argue, in fact, that these gopher tortoises in the coastal strand ecosystems play an extremely important role as a keystone species, and they may play an even increasingly important role as we continue to battle the results of climate change and sea level rise. But they may be more threatened. These coastal gopher tortoise populations may be even more threatened than their inland counterparts, which by all accounts should be on the endangered species list because of habitat loss to development and because of the coastal squeeze impacts overall. In the last bullet here, the vegetated cover on this stabilized, which helps stabilize the dunes, we mapped at actually increasing from a 30% loss from the combination of both hurricanes to a recovery of 17% after 1 year of not having hurricanes. So that's pretty speedy recovery, really, in such a dynamic ecosystem. And gopher tortoises may very well have a role to play in that. So in summary, I have a couple more things I want to just address fairly quickly, but these are important. Like I said, ecosystem services, our gopher tortoises doing things for free just by living their lives, just like wetlands do for us. Wetlands filter stormwater. They help with buffering wave action and on and on and on. And that's an ecosystem service. Trees provide us with oxygen and help clear clear air pollution. There are all kinds of ecosystem services that our biodiverse planet helps provide us that they never get credit for. And we think that the gopher tortoises are engaging in these ecosystem services as well, such as dune stabilization, but they are threatened. So how can we help them? Possibly temporarily, we can continue to do artificial dune construction like you'll see out in Villano Beach, and it's moving up in South Ponte Vedra and Ponte Vedra Beach probably. You've seen it on St. Augustine Beach. That's a temporary solution, especially in the face of increasing rates of sea level rise. We may very well need to restore habitat on the west side of A1A for the population in the GTM Research Reserve that would enable these gopher tortoises to be actually moved. We could trap them and walk them across the road and start some preliminary holes for them, burrows for them, and let them do their thing to avoid the increasing threats of sea level rise and storm damage, because they are being crowded, they're being squeezed into a smaller and smaller amount of habitat. But it's not just gopher tortoises. We have a stake in this whole coastal squeeze sea level rise thing too. And we're faced with it. I mean, you ask anybody with an oceanfront home who's had to fortify their home, spend a lot of money, or even move, what are we going to do? And not just in the US, but throughout the world. Coastal habitats for humans and other organisms are being lost due to our own actions, anthropogenic changes related to climate change. How will we adapt? We have to be thinking about that, and we have to be acting on it. Secondly, and this is not good news, we, the humans, the anthropogenic, we're causing the 6th major mass extinction. It's widely recognized by scientists and many, many others that humans need biodiversity to survive. The pandemic is actually one evidence of that. By reducing biodiversity, we're actually increasing the ability of pathogens to get to humans. And that's just one of the many, many reasons we don't want to decrease biodiversity. And it's essential that we protect biodiversity for all generations. In fact, there's a major initiative, international initiative, the Conservation for Biodiversity, that is gearing up. It's kicked off in Paris in January of 2021, and it's gearing up to make some major recommendations. We need to take major action right away in order to protect biodiversity. And let's hope we can get that happening in 2021. The Biden administration has committed to 30% of American land, the US land, being in some type of conservation status that provides ecosystem services during his administration, and that is welcome news. But we have to do that throughout the world. We need to stop the loss of biodiversity. I want to be sure to thank the many students, my family members, my colleagues who have helped with data collection over the years, tramping all around those dunes, sweating in the hot sun, and then jumping into the ocean to cool off. But I just want to make sure to thank all of those folks. Some of them, a few of them have participated to such a degree that they've become co-authors as undergraduates in my research papers, the 2 research papers, but there are many, many, many people who have contributed, and I really appreciate that. I want to thank all of you who are here today. And I really appreciate your time, your attention, your interest. This is, as you can probably see, I'm really passionate about this. I love the Iguana Reserve, and it is one of the most special places in the entire universe, and I hope we can all appreciate it for that. And finally, I want to thank the GTM research staff for the long and productive relationship that we've had, the partnership that we've had with Flagler College. It's been about 15 years, but I see a lot more on the horizon. And if you will bear with me, I would like to I'm going to check the time and make sure that we have time to do this. Oh, we don't. I'm not going to show you this video, but I am going to stop here and answer questions if there are any in this last part.
Yep. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation.
Sure.
I do have time for a couple. And also on behalf of GTM, we are happy to be partnered with you and Flagler as well. Nicole has a question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm assuming maybe verbal.
Okay, should I ask my question?
There you go.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
hi. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I remember I spoke to Mike Shirley a couple of years ago, who was the executive director of GTM.
Sure.
I said, beach renourishment is coming in Ponte Vedra, and what about GTM beaches? Are you going to get in on that? And he said, no, we just let our beaches do their natural thing.
Mhm.
And now, after seeing your presentation, how much was lost, and then you mentioned the possibility of dune restoration. And I'm wondering, is that maybe possibly back on the table that you would consider renourishment?
It's one tool in the toolkit. And frankly, because the GTM Research Reserve does have good habitat on the west side of A1A, the better choice for the reserve might be to work on restoring that habitat, preparing Gopher Tortoises to be relocated there. And other places, they don't have that option. And so that's why I included it, Nicole. That's a great question. But we may well be looking at doing some artificial dune.
Okay, because of course, the FEMA berm is coming up in June, July.
Yeah.
So I don't
Yeah.
know if that's, a possibility. Another thing is I know
Yeah.
sea turtles.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a high priority for the GTM Research Reserve because they've done such a great job of protecting if you omit A1A, which they have no choice about.
Right.
And I will put the video link in the chat right now. That's a great idea. Let me get that. And that's actually, it's shameless self-promotion. That's not what I'm trying to do here at all. What I am trying to do is highlight the fact that my students who participate, as Madison knows well, And Savannah's actually in the group too. That's the link right there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we have to sign off, but I really appreciate everybody coming out. There's the link to everybody, and that's an interview with my students at the college produced, a couple of my students on the most recent paper. It was an all-female scientific team, so that's why I wanted to highlight it and also just illustrate how important undergraduate research is.
Oops.
I really appreciate all your comments, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Actually, we are going to launch a poll
Really quick.
in order to get a little bit of feedback from you guys. And while we have everyone participate in that poll, if you guys have any more questions, we have time to take about 1 or 2 more.
I forgot to show my literature cited slide. Sorry, y'all.
And Brittany, I think you'll have to launch that poll.
Relaunch.
I don't have the controls to do it right now.
It's saying that it is failing to launch polling. So not sure why that is, because I'm able to see it. I might have to just manually send it to everyone who was here today. Yeah, for some reason it's not enabling being launched. Sorry about that. These things happen, it seems, with Zoom, and you're muted. So, sorry that didn't work there, but I will try to manually just send that out to everybody through the same email that you gave for a confirmation. Did we have one more question that we could have Barbara answer? I guess while we wait, okay, I'll go ahead and show a couple upcoming events on behalf of GTM. So we have a couple marine land hikes, and our marine land beach walk is in need of some registrants if anybody is interested. I did put the link to that in the chat box in here. And then our River to Sea guided trail walk is sold out, which, by the way, hi Ron, he's here today. He's our volunteer that leads our River to Sea hike. But I am able to put you on a waiting list because we do get cancellations. And then our next GTM talks is going to be Mike Sullivan of Commander's Shellfish Camp. So, and we want to thank you again, Barbara. This has been wonderful.
You're most welcome. I really enjoyed it. And I'm just really grateful that people are interested in these topics because this is great. It's near and dear to my heart, and I know you share that.
I actually learned that there's 33 different species of birds that use the Gopher Tortoise burrow. I did not know that.
There's more than that, but
More than 33.
There's 33 that we have in the Iguana Reserve that
Okay.
expected to use Gopher Tortoise burrows. I think I have that right.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care.